experience today. And it will be my great pleasure to welcome David Maggs to be our moderator. I'm going to say a few words about David. He has a career as an interdisciplinary artist and arts researcher. He's the founder of and pianist for the Dirk Five. He's a writer for the stage and an augmented reality researcher. He's the artistic director for Grossmorn Summer Music Festival, the founder and publisher for a digital arts magazine, the director of the Graham Academy in Youth Training. He has co-produced the CBC documentary, The Country, and he is also a fellow at the Monk School for Global Affairs. He has spoken at many events, including the Canadian Arts Summit, most recently, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So this is a multidisciplinary brain that we are about to welcome to our stage. Please also look for his book, The Hopeful Monster, which is upcoming soon. He is the perfect moderator for a very complex discussion. David, welcome to the stage. I know we're going to introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate that. Welcome very much. And thank you, Claire, and thank you, Sandy, for hosting this event. And what an incredible room to see the kind of turnout for this problem or question or opportunity. I think I got asked to do this because I thought I was the person in the country who loved the question of art and social impact more than anyone alive. And that may still be true, but I'm just so heartened to see that there's about 300 other people who gave up a beautiful afternoon to be with us today. I'm here to invite a brilliant reflecting pool to the stage, a panel that will discuss these issues in collaboration with Geoffrey on this. So please join me at the stage panel. Gaëtane Verna is the director of the Powerplant Contemporary Art Gallery here in Toronto. She previously served as the executive director and chief curator at the Musée d'Art de Joliette in Lanaudière, Quebec, the curator of the Foreman Art Gallery at Bishop's University, where she also taught art history. In 2018, Verna was presented with the insignia of the Order of Arts and Letters by the Cultural Service of the Embassy of France in Canada. Welcome, welcome, Gaëtane. Christina Loewen has led Opera.ca as executive director since 2009. Recognized for innovative thinking, collaborative leadership, and cross-sectoral approaches, she has launched new initiatives for the opera sector in areas of innovation, resilience, and systems thinking, capitalization, entrepreneurship, and lean startup principles, and evaluating impact. So we're very glad to have Christina with us today. Barry Hughson joined the National Ballet of Canada as Executive Director in 2014, accelerating its trajectory of artistic growth, fiscal responsibility, community engagement, and international presence, including landmark international tours, New York City, Paris, and Russia, some of the real cultural capitals of the world. Beginning his career as a dancer with the Washington Ballet, he has since served as an executive leader at many distinguished companies in the U.S. before joining us here in Canada. In 2018, he joined the Equity Project, a 3-year initiative to address racial diversity in ballet, and is serving on the coordinating committee for respectful workplaces in the arts. Welcome, Barry. Owais Lightwala, he was the biographically most elusive member of this panel. Under his bio, you can discover the fascinating origins of his surname and some veiled opinions on the weather and foliage of his childhood home. It takes little digging from Rachel Kennedy, however, to connect him with the trailblazing innovation and success of Why Not Theatre, where he is managing director. A graduate of York University's theatre program, he has been the part of the Impact Program for Arts Leaders out of Stanford, completed the Harvard Business School's CORE program, and in 2018, he was a Diverse City Fellow, and in the 2018 cohort of the Toronto Cultural Leaders Lab. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome these stunning panelists. Geoffrey, yes, I didn't think you were going to leave, so please come up and join us. When to come and when to leave. Those are the real crucial things about this.
No one told me.
Yeah, that's right. We wanted to see you improvise a little bit.
You did better choreo.
That's right. Yeah, there are probably some wonderful choreographers in the room. I'd like to start with just a gut check question. When, with a panel, when we ask you about social impact in the arts, what is the gut reaction for everyone? Does that feel like it's an unfair question to ask? Do we sort of salivate and say, that's a great question, I can't wait to talk about it? Do we feel like that might be the wrong question in some way? How do you hear that question right now? Can we let this go? Okay.
I think it's a question that I'm always thinking on a daily basis as I run a non-for-profit institution that receives multi-level layers of funding from the private sector to the public sector, and that I feel I'm always questioning: are we relevant to the public that we with all our heart try to serve? And how do we deal with the fact that some of the things that we really believe in might never touch a segment of the population, and whether that is good enough to know that, when I lived in Joliette, I had a very close relationship with the mayor of the city of Joliette, and he would always tell me that if he had to do a survey about whether we should have a museum or a hockey ring, that most people would say yes to a hockey ring. He thought the opposite. He thought that he just said this to me so that I could always think of how relevant I was to different people. And for myself, it's always been this notion that within a city, we should have both. We should have people that can go to hockey and people that can go to see the arts. And it's not necessarily about the number, but at least providing the services to both and not to put them in jeopardy, one or the other. But that as a director of an institution, I must always think of how relevant I am. So it is a question that I'm constantly grappling with without a finite answer.
Christina?
I've been long preoccupied by this notion of how the arts, in particular the not-for-profit arts, fulfill our social contract. So when we say that we are charities and we are part of the social contract because we are of public good or civic good or however you want to describe it, I'm always struck by how ill-equipped we are to describe that. How do we actually contribute to social good, and what are the tools and languages that we have to describe that? And I've always found that very lacking. So I'm very much looking forward to that conversation. It's something that we've been developing at Opera.ca, is a kind of framework and a language for talking about how opera contributes to civic impact. We now actually have a framework that we're going to be announcing we were supposed to announce it last week, but we're not quite there yet. So probably in about a week or two, we'll be able to finalize it. And it really does provide a roadmap and a common vocabulary that the entire opera sector has articulated. So it's not something that is coming from top down. It's very much a ground up kind of process. And now it's time for us to actually start populating this framework now and being able to, use that tool to talk about the impact that we've been having. So I'm very excited.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I have to say, I'm really grateful to have the space for the conversation, because I think that for those of us who run larger institutions, creating the space for these conversations is really important, and I think it's an important role that funders can play in allowing this conversation to unfold. I will just get this out of the way. I was a ballet dancer 100 pounds and 30 years ago, but I have spent my life in the arts from childhood, and I have actually worked in the context of amateur community art making, small dance companies, worked for many years with an urban high school for the performing arts in Baltimore, Maryland, and I've worked with various Special Arts International, bringing dance to people with disabilities. So value for me is a value of the arts is a core human value for me, and it's an interesting conversation in the context of large institutions. How do you challenge challenge long-standing systems while also continuing to pay a living wage to artists, which is also a responsibility of large institutions. So it's something that I grapple with every day, and I think it's a really important conversation. I'm delighted to be here to be part of it.
Thank you very much.
You asked what our gut response was
A
to
gut
that?
response to whether that question feels great, wrong, or unfair.
My gut response was I feel like I don't really understand why. I also like my panelists spend a lot of time thinking about what the value of what we do is, and then I'm like, but why do I spend so much time worrying about it? Because I don't think the religion isn't going around having conferences about the value of religion. The military leaders of the world, they're not having conferences where they're like, is your military proving effective for your community? Are you really giving them dollar for dollar impact for the amount of money you spend on tanks? And it feels like we are particularly concerned with our impact and relevance, and I think there's within that something going on. While the report is so broad in its scope in terms of what it defines as arts and culture, this conversation, this room is very nonprofit, publicly subsidized arts and culture, and this panel is as well. And I think we have a particular fear that we are not really living up to our accountability standards for our communities, for the funding that we get. And I think it has created a culture of anxiety amongst our industry that we just take for granted that we should even ask this question of does the arts have value? Whereas there's so many other things that I could argue all day don't have any value, but they assume it and they just live it, and and I use religion and military as examples because they're also publicly funded and subsidized in a way that at least you can understand that there's all these for-profit corporations that are trying to make money. So if they have no other purpose, God bless them. But really, what is so why are we asking our question? That's my gut reaction. And I think it speaks to something that we have this insecurity, and that insecurity speaks to something true that's happening in our society, which is maybe we're not relevant anymore. And let's talk about what that means now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that's a great response to feel a little bit of resistance, a little bit of enthusiasm, and a lot of nervousness about this. Geoffrey, in terms of how that plays out, you've been having these conversations around the world. Are we on average here in Canada? Or are we unusually fretful?
I think that it's the kind of responses, and they're not uninteresting responses because they each come personally from your own organizations or your own career trajectories. So I'm not sort of belittling them, but they're the kind of comments that people in the publicly funded sector tend to make when asked these questions. And I think that, and so obviously around the world when I've been speaking to people, they've essentially Europe, North America, there are similar discourses going on. There are national differences, but Europe is different, certainly from the United States in many ways, as I was talking about when I was in Indiana just 2 or 3 days ago. But basically, those conversations are similar. If one goes, say, to East Asia, one finds different kinds of conversations going on, which really are more explicitly about the economic and urban value of what's happening, and much less reticence about simply tackling those issues and addressing them head on, because it's a very different kind of society with different imperatives behind it. But can I just add a comment or two from what's been said, David? Is that allowed?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't want to come back on everything that's been said, but there are, because so much of it was interesting, but there are 2 points that I want to make. One of them about the military. I think you'd be, well, certainly I can only speak for the UK, be unwise to think that the military isn't constantly defending its position and its funding. It doesn't do it by standing up saying, what's our social impact? Mm-hmm. Nor does it stand up and say, we are more valuable than people think, and all of those. It doesn't have that, but they are all the time positioning themselves with what they see as under-resourcing, and making sure that they are visible in those areas around the world where they think that people at home will regard that as important. And that's often in tension with what government wants. So the way they handle it is totally different. But I think they're in the same position. They just don't sound defensive in the way that we do. one other comment, two other quick comments. One of them is on we've got mostly non-profit in this room. There's no need for me to pursue the argument. I made it in my talk, and you heard me then. But I do think that separating out the non-profit, the publicly funded, from the rest of art and culture does us harm, because we need to show that we're part of this whole world of art and culture which is going on, where other things are happening just as valuable and just as important for people as what we are. And then we make the case about why our bit justifies some public subsidy of one kind or another. And I've been struck by really nice example. I won't give you the examples now, but there are examples where using willingness to pay econometric techniques, people have been found to be willing to pay from their taxes for art that they never ever encountered or liked. But they did so because they actually wanted to be in a society where people who did like that could see it, and they knew that it couldn't actually stand on its own feet financially. So we should actually position ourselves within the whole cultural world. And one other thing about value as a core human value, I think actually it's something quite important in a sense it's something we would all sign up to. But I think one of the problems we have is that, and this comes about in the well-being debate, in which we try and show that museums and arts institutions contribute to well-being, that when people have visited them, they say that their sense of life satisfaction or of happiness is higher. I don't actually have a great deal of confidence in those kinds of well-being surveys, but I think what we should be doing is saying that well-being is much more than feeling happy. There are other ways of establishing well-being. There's the capabilities approach and so on. But we should be arguing that a fundamental component of well-being is a rich cultural life, whatever that is. Not that a rich cultural life provides well-being, but that you cannot have a state of well-being without a rich cultural life, together with other things, like other things about housing and income and so on. But I think we need to position, back to your opening question about social impact. I'm uneasy about the term impact because it seems very directional. We do things and there's the impact out there. I think we need to position ourselves much more centrally in these debates. And I'll stop talking now because I've had long enough.
Thank you. That is, I think, how we want to set this up, is if we can just have things trickle on down the line until you can catch them. As deftly as you just did. One thing that would be helpful, I think, both in terms of setting up Geoffrey for a rich week of conversations, is just to sort of try and take the presentation that he just gave, the study that was done in the UK, and I've actually read the whole thing. It's one of those reports where you actually enjoy reading the whole thing. It's just a fantastic document. Setting those ideas in a Canadian context, as broadly as you can think, before we get into that. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but were there particular things for people that thought, well, that's a one-to-one translation, or I'd have to really figure out how that applies in a Canadian context, things that seem to be outright contradicted by the things that you see in a national context? How do the sorts of things in the AHRC report translate to what we're seeing on the ground here in Canada, to the best of your abilities? And anyone would like to start, Gaëtane. I'm not necessarily trying to put the pressure on you, though you are the nearest.
I would say that there's a lot of the points are very relevant to some of the research that's been published in Canada, and it's true that what happens in the UK is often we are in conversation, and so there were no huge surprises to me, but I would say that it did open other questions for me. I mean, of course, the whole question living in Toronto of urban regeneration, and we've been doing some kind of some work funded by the THC around what do artists need in the city in Toronto, and their biggest problem is they can't afford to live in the city, and arts worker can't afford to live in the city also. So on the one hand, we're talking about arts as an economic motor of the society, yet the people who are at the core of it can't really live here. And what are the solutions to that? And that's so I see, and then I really like the whole, and I think it's good for board members to also understand this whole questions of measurable metrics. And when we are constantly pushed to say, like, how do you measure success? And is success just by numbers or by revenue and we have to answer to these questions. How do we use such a survey and such information to actually inform our board members, our staff also, to evaluate their performance on different levels that are as valuable, but understanding how both function together and speak to each other in order to shape something that is specific to our own individual organization. Because you can't, take an example, I can't evaluate the performance of the power plant next to the performance of the National Ballet. We're two different organizations, different sizes, different budgets. And too often, whether it's, I would say, private donors or even audiences, they're like always comparing whether, the ballet is more important than the visual arts. To me, again, I think a lot of the points that were made should push us to think, to take a step back and think of the own context of production as a key matrix.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. There's, the Canadian context, or maybe I might even speak a little bit about the North American context. I've been noticing a lot of framework building going on. Like just looking at, we're about to announce our Opera Civic Impact Framework. When we first started developing this, Animating Democracy came out with their Social Impact Explorer. Everyone's familiar with aesthetic perspectives. And that's just, the Canada Council for the Arts has their own impact framework as well that they're developing. And now we're just talking about the arts, but, when you look at what some of the not-for-profit community indicator frameworks are, there's, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. We just wrote a digital strategy grant for the Canada Council to sort of try to activate and make our framework a very useful tool. And that introduced me to, the United Nations sustainability goals, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, there's an awful lot of frameworks out there. What are we building towards? Are we looking to seek some kind of common standard measurement for the arts sector? And if we are, is that measure something that we're going to try to integrate with our community partners who are also measuring using completely different frameworks? So I think we have to talk a little bit about standardization, and if that's one of our goals. And if it's not, just recognize the fact that, when we build these frameworks, we really have to take into consideration what exists already and how these frameworks might talk to each other. So interoperability, I think, becomes a key concern.
Yeah, standardization is, I think, impossible. I think that it's how we've historically gotten ourselves in trouble in the past. We continue, no matter what we're trying to measure, we're continually trying to get everyone to fit in the same box. And, the cultural ecosystem is an ecosystem, and we all have a role to play within that ecosystem. And I sort of bristle at the idea of more standardization. That said, I think it all resonates in Canada. I do also bristle at this idea of, and forgive the government funders in the room, but that we are government subsidized or public subsidized in a significant way. I think the difference, the UK is changing, but it's still quite different. There's still a great deal more subsidy in the UK than there is in Canada, and so really we're not that different than the commercial entertainment world, at least in the major institutional context. In that, more than 76% of our $40 million budget at the National Ballet every year, we have to generate. We have to go and find through earned and contributed revenue outside of government sources. So there's tremendous pressure. So I think that's something I want to point out.
I feel like in terms of context, what feels to me like the biggest difference between my work in the theater world between Canada and the UK is the history of the countries are so far apart in that we are a much younger nation, and even our immigrant populations have been immigrants for less time, and there's less of a sense of maturity within our forms and within our institutions and within our communities and our culture. So part of the thing, when I go to London, I see theater there, and I see the much more complex ecology that they have, including the West End, which I think personally, my own theory is what is a huge economic and social engine that allows for a lot of for not-for-profit and smaller theater to exist, because there's this massive force that's lifting the tide of theater in the city, which we don't really have a corollary for in Toronto. We have one major commercial presenter, Mirvish. We had a few who tried and failed and lost all their money, and we don't have the same critical mass in the theater world here. But the issues that you've outlined in terms of what the cultural value proposition is are very similar. I would say we have the same inequalities, we have the same representation challenges, we have a very similar difficulty in the publicly funded part of the sector justifying our value and get caught in the same economic arguments all the time. But at the same time, we don't even have, I feel like here's not even the same level of community engagement with our larger constituent base as they do in the UK, because there's just a longer history of the existence of culture there and the existence of a British culture that you can take pride in and own as your own. Even for people who are new to Britain, who have been there still a lot longer than, in some cases, people in Canada have been, who I've lost the train of what I'm saying now. I think it's fun.
As you wish, Geoffrey.
Yeah, quick. I knew where you were going with that one.
Thank you.
Even if you weren't sure. This is another discussion about what has happened to the concept of a national culture in my country, because I don't feel that is any longer something that we feel at all confident about what it means and what people mean by it. But just a couple of observations on the things that came up, because so much of interesting was said. But back to Gaëtane's point. Reference to board members in particular. One of the things that I think board members need to do is to be much more demanding about what they want the achievements of their organisation to be, and that it's the job of the organisation and the artistic directors of it to make them more demanding. And by more demanding, I mean to actually be demanding about the outcomes of the artistic activity, the social, the community, in the wider outcomes, rather than asking primarily for fairly standardized data that shows that the organization has been successful in those terms. And I'm not blaming board members for this, because I don't think they're helped necessarily to do it. But I think if a cultural organisation has real ambitions, not simply to be solvent at the end of the year, and not simply to fill the audiences for most of their activities, but rather to make a difference, whatever that difference they're trying to make is, then they should encourage their board members to actually ask them to evaluate and see whether they've made that difference. But that means also encouraging board members to accept different forms of evaluation, exactly as I was arguing, rather than just a set of numbers. And I think there's a sense of complicit engagement there, and one could do so much better, and I think it would be helpful to do so much better. The other issue is the point that Christina made about an awful lot of frameworks. My very first question, you'll remember, is who wants to know and why? And with all these frameworks being delivered, I still don't know. And it's not unique to Canada. One sees them elsewhere as well, but there seems to be a particular interest at the moment in Canada. But they're being developed. Why are we having them? What is the need that they are fulfilling? And I think there's a real challenge there, because my feeling is that the more we standardize frameworks, the more distant we will get from the actual purposes of what we're doing that I was talking about and that we've all been talking about. And yet frameworks seem like something that's worth producing. As I should be saying, for those of you who come to this event on a smaller round table on Friday morning talking about some of these issues, I think what we need is toolkits rather than frameworks. Toolkits and good practice from which an organisation can and a set of artists can draw as the right ones to evaluate what they're doing, rather than a standardised framework that people have to fit into. But that's my question. Why do we have frameworks? Who thinks they're going to be helpful?
Can I ask a point of clarity on that? Because when I hear you say, engaging the board members to be much more specific, I'm hearing sort of executive directors like wince around the room at that point, right? So and I know that's not what you mean in terms of creating a whole bunch of tangible outcomes that they can then check and see if we got at the end, but there's a much more robust sense of what that looks like. Is the secret in that distinction the difference between a framework and a toolkit? Is there a relationship between the first recommendation and the second one?
Not really, because frameworks and toolkits tend to exist. You don't have a framework for one institution. You just have its evaluation strategy or its evidence strategy. A framework is across institutions, sometimes it's even across sectors, can be across disciplines. And so I wasn't thinking that about an individual framework, individual institution. I too saw the wincing around the room when I said it, which is why I said it the way I said it. Because I think that what is needed is board members know that the art is about more than just the thing which they are absolutely responsible for. And I'm a board member myself, and I know this, which is to make sure that the organisation is solvent and that what it does is legal and that it actually does the basic things it's meant to be doing. That, of course, is what a board's there for. But most board members also believe that there's more to it. They're on the board of a particular artistic institution because they believe in that discipline or believe in what our institution's doing. And yet they don't often enough ask for real evidence about the achievements, other than audience satisfaction is probably the most one comes to. Well, back to the kind of things I was talking about in my talk. If one of the things we're trying to do in a particular production, theatre production, is to get people, the audience, to reflect critically on their own attitudes towards immigration, towards death, towards all sorts of things that we might be trying to do, then what I mean by being demanding is the board should expect some of the evaluation to be out whether that was achieved or not. And we do very, very little of that. What we do as people in the arts on the whole is capture anecdotes of what somebody said as they were coming out. And we never remember the ones where they said that was a waste of time. We remember them saying, that's transformed my thinking about everything. And we can do better than that. And I think that's what I meant by board members being encouraged to be more demanding in those kind of ways, which I think is what we ought to be as well.
So maybe then the next useful question to ask is around metrics and the kinds of measurements that we feel the kind of freedom to do. Is there a sense of vulnerability in terms of saying, I want to be way more invasive, I want to be way more expansive with what I'm trying to measure here? Is there a sense across the panel of there being a level of vulnerability associated with trying to ask harder questions of yourself? There was a lot in that talk about the difference between really evaluating what you're doing and putting something together that justifies your funding. In the effort to move from the justifying your funding to a deeper evaluation of what you're doing, does it feel like it's an obvious translation, or are there some obstacles that sit between one and the other, and what do those look like?
Well, I would say that it really depends on the individual leading the organization. I think that as executive directors, you have to decide every day, why do I do what I do? And then you have to do it the way you want to do it, which is what, we've been trying to do at the Power Plant, which is as an institution from the first time I set foot in there when I was hired. I told my CEO, I don't want to be the only one. And he looked at me, I said, look at me. I don't want to be the only one sitting at the table. So it's a process that I decided from the get-go. And then you build the blocks of what it is that, the people that sit around the table, which means your staff, your board, in the activity ways that you do, you kind of, we decided that we wanted to be an institution that was integrating a large part of the population, but it is scary to, at one point, think of being culturally diverse, which is what we are, and we're proud to be that. And then to say, and this comes from the board in a very engaged and empathetic way, that like, oh my God, people don't know the power plant. And they say it not because they feel that I'm failing. They're like, what do we need to do so that more people know you? And so then, once you achieve balanced budget, now they're all going, all right, we need to invest more in marketing and communication, which in our country, sometimes when you receive grants, you always feel bad about putting more money in marketing and communication because it feels like you're just wasting money. Even though if we want people to come to a gallery, you actually need to tell them that you exist. And it's not a given that they know you exist. So even if you do the best program, and if people from Paris will know the power plant, the cab drivers don't know the power plant. And that's my metric, knowing that we're not integrated into a larger community because people don't know where we are. So I think that having said this, it is about having, as Geoffrey said, having these honest conversations with the board to understand together where we're at and how one can grow and say, well, now we've achieved one level, what's the next level for the organization? And that next level is not necessarily building an extra wing to the power plant. Maybe the next level is we, luckily, and we're very thankful, we received this grant from Trillium to do a program where we were diversifying accessibility program, and a very, some really small program with, as part of this whole thing, March of Dimes, which is an organization, and our impact in working with them is very small in numbers. And I was very touched by the fact that our treasurer, who's all about money, said, you know what, you really need to bring this to the board so that the board understands how this program, you are growing the organization, maybe not in number, but in the quality of your approach to that small group. So that's not the sexiest activity to do, but it has an impact on a very small population, and that's what you have chosen to do as an organization. So I think it's really for us executive directors working with, again, when I say the board, I also think of our staff. They also need to understand, the goals that we put out. And yes, it's scary because in our 3-year plan now, I've said that we would try to achieve 100,000 visitors. And I'm going, how are we going to find those 40,000 people to come? And then will my success be only on the 100,000 that it's taken me 7 years to agree to put a number? Because I never wanted to put a number. But then, that becomes a point where maybe if everybody's honest about the possibilities and where the investment needs to come, then you do put a number because you need to reach something. It can't just be like, yes, we'll have more people, but how many more? Is 5%, 10% more? So.
Thank you, Gaëtane.
So in reading Geoffrey's report, I was struck by two things which seem kind of in opposition to each other. One, that, as an arts and cultural sector, we need to engage in more evaluation, and yet also how there is that the current methods of evaluation are very much lacking in rigor and quality, right? And so, I want to talk a little bit about evaluative capacity, because as arts organizations, our core business is not evaluation. Our core business is art making, and the evaluation, this is a very big subject matter. There's so many different kinds of evaluation. And if we're expected to be better at this and do better, we have to talk about how we're going to become better. This is, even simple forms of evaluation can be quite taxing on an arts organization. And I think that, the way that we've been approaching evaluation has been very much from an evaluation 101 kind of standpoint, when what we really need is, evaluation 5 501 or 601, like higher and higher levels of evaluation. And so, it's one of the questions that comes to mind is, how do we get better? Maybe standardization is a way that we can get better, because it's a bit of a paint by numbers way. So, you use the training wheels and you just follow the graph, and then, you learn how to do it, and then you can express your own individuality later, once you've sort of drawn within the lines.
Does that mean, you leapt right to the challenge of how to do it well. Does that mean that implied in that answer is you don't feel a kind of obstacle between the freedom to do it, the opportunity to do it, the invitation to do it vis-a-vis your relationship with funders, your public, your board, et cetera?
Well, there seems to be a really, high propensity for doing it badly. Mm-hmm. It's like, should we do it? Yes, but, how do we know whether or not we're doing it well? Right. So I'm sitting up here and I'm saying we have an Opera Civic Impact Framework. Isn't that great? And then I read Geoffrey's report and I thought, we're not really controlling against anything. Right? Like, I can see giant gaps in what we've created. And so now I think about this and I think, is that good enough? And, or is it just good enough to start somewhere?
Thank you. Eric?
I've been thinking about the board thing. Thinking a lot about that. I do think we have to get real about that, and we have to reimagine the profile of a board member for these institutions and what it means. I think the reality is that at whatever level of the ecosystem you're working in, we have razor thin margins, whether it's Shannon putting together an independent project at Harbourfront Center or the National Ballet putting on a season at the Four Seasons Center. There's razor thin margins. And so there's so much, there has been historically so much focus on building boards that are about wealth and about capacity to give and to invest. And while that will continue to remain important and valuable, I think we also have to think about how we create space on our boards for a different kind of trustee. And it's a tough conversation. Again, it's pushing against long-standing systems. But I do think we have to get real about that, because it's not going to happen the way our boards are currently structured. I would also say that I think what is challenging is this idea of adaptability, this idea of large institutions being able to test ideas in a way that doesn't put the institution in financial jeopardy, and there's very little room for error. And so I think that's held the industry. It's very easy to settle back into norms to protect sort of the ongoing sustainability of the organization. But in the meantime, everything around us is changing. And if we can't get with the program, we are going to be irrelevant. So that's sort of what keeps me up at night.
I'm thinking a lot about the thing you said about the vulnerability of metrics and the requirement of evaluation and what it feels like to us in terms of running our organizations. I feel like right now our problem is a bit the opposite, where with Why Not, we've been trying for the last few years to really ask ourselves at every step of the company's growth, why are we doing this, and is this the best way to do this? And as we try to do things in new ways, often the challenge with that is, like, it's very hard to evaluate if you're being successful or not, because you haven't done the thing yet, and no one has tried to do the thing in this way. So we created this thing called the Riser Project, which is a incubator, accelerator for emerging artists. That's also a collaboration of many different companies, and they work in a way that is very, very difficult and complicated to explain in a simple way. And when we were creating it and we were pitching it to people, we would often get asked, like, well, what's going to be the impact of this thing? And, like, what's the value of it? And, like, are you going to, and we came up with, like, the only things that we could was qualitative, was like, it saves 33% in costs, and 2/3 of the people who do this go on to have future tours. And people are like, got it, that I understand. But when you get into, like, the nuance of, it really changed this artist's career to have the validation of the support of a whole community rather than produce independently. And I really appreciated that being in the report, this hierarchy of numbers over qualitative forms of evaluation. So I think because we came from the ground up, like a startup that is very much based in the theater community, it was intuitive to us what was working and what wasn't working, but it was very hard to make the case sometimes because it felt like what our intuition was telling us, what people were telling us was not valid, or as valid as like studies and numbers, and everyone wants to see, or at least that's what the feeling was as we were trying to build support around it. And now, as we're continuing to do that, now we've gotten way crazier with our ambitions. We want to give free space to all artists and free childcare and create a new audience initiation program. Those are actual things we're working on. And when people in our board, I was really scared when you said get more demanding, because they've already been like, and one of them sitting right here, the other one's over there. They're like, what are you doing? Like, what is that? How is that going to work? What is the model of this? And is this a good idea or a bad idea? And we're going, we don't know. No one has tried to do this. This is probably really dangerous. And at the same time, we need to be able to, to your point of adaptability, we need to be able to take risks while we are still nimble enough to do that. Otherwise, I think part of how large institutions get themselves in that position is through reinforcing cycles of feeling like the less risky thing to do is the same old. And I would argue the more risky thing to do is the same old when the whole world is just like constantly shifting under us. And for us, I think we're constantly trying to give ourselves a challenge that seems a little bit too crazy so that we never get comfortable with what we're doing. And so with that, how do we evaluate that? How do we evaluate the impact of our work is also a challenge, because the thing we're trying to do, we don't know yet how to do. And so how to make the case for it is like an additional level of difficulty. And it would be a lot easier if there wasn't this hierarchy of what forms of evaluation, and there was more capacity, to your point, Christina, about the lack of our capacity to do that, because it's hard enough just to do the thing, and now you have to like convince people that you're doing a good job, in addition to the fact that you're doing the thing, which is it's hard. It's super hard already. It's like giving an exam and then at the same time like convincing someone else that you're doing the exam well, but you're doing the exam. If you were like, the exam should be enough. I'll get a pass, and then that's the point. That's how you know.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And when you said about the hard fit, the really risky thing is doing the same thing that you've done before. John Cage memorably said, people tell me they're scared of new ideas. I don't know why. It's the old ideas that scare me. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of sense that the past is not what makes you secure, actually. I think that in terms of, I'm glad that you shook as well when I said make your board more demanding. I think you described precisely the situation that one wants a good board to do, which is not to say, oh, that looks risky, you shouldn't do it. But rather, that looks exciting, but it's risky. How are you going to manage the risk? Mm-hmm. And what happens if it doesn't come off? What's the damage? And those kinds of questions are the ones to be asked. Otherwise, for board members here, there's no point in being on the board of an arts organisation if you're not willing to have exciting risks taken. But the job of the board is to make sure that everything that's going on isn't simply exciting risks that no one is managing. And I think that similarity between being an effective, genuine entrepreneur and effective creative is an important one. It's all about coming up with great ideas and then managing the risk to maximise the chances of them succeeding. And it's that I think is that it's that coming together of board and organisation that's important. Just one other thing I wanted to come back on is to pick up on is Christina's very important point about evaluative capacity. I think that I would make a distinction. Controls we can talk about another time, but I think that the issue of the absence of control is which is simply saying, could something else have actually had just the same effect, even more, that was nothing to do with art? I think that's when we come to sector or discipline level claims, when very often it's simply the fact of any kind of intervention that produces some outcomes. But I don't think an institution on its own, an organisation on its own, should be needing to do controls, unless it's actually trying to do some kind of very focused social intervention in a community where it needs to get some sense of whether anyone intervening with sport or something else would have had the same effect. No, but the point about evaluative capacity is a really important one. And I think that what different levels of organisation can do depends on scale and capacity. It's got to be realistic for yourself. But I think there is a distinction, and it's one I made in early on there, between evaluation and reflective practice. If evaluation is for accountability and for reporting on, what any organisation should be wanting to do is reflective practice. Artists, directors, creative directors, and so on, and the organisation as a whole, wanting to know whether what it's been doing has been effective in what it was trying to achieve. And that clearly should feed into evaluation as well. But I think that that kind of evaluative capacity is what any serious arts organisation should want to have and should want to make some kind of space for. And I know that can be difficult at times. Final point, in terms of relationship between all of this and metrics, I think we have to recognise a real challenge in which there are a whole variety of stakeholders interested in the outcomes of what an arts organisation is doing. However much one would love to be completely pure and say it's the art is all that it matters and it's achieving its outcome, reality is we live in a world where there are all kinds of stakeholders are involved. Some of them incredibly enthusiastic and committed, others less so, but they need to be kept engaged, and that's why I think multi-criteria evaluation is such an important way of doing it, rather than a standardised one. A multi-criteria one, you decide the different criteria against which you would want to be evaluated, and some of those will be quite limited in their perspective metrics, because there are people who need those. It's limiting it to the metrics that's the problem, rather than having them there at all.
Terrific. Well, that's our time at this point, so I need to thank our panel and thank Professor Crossick for taking us from the pressures around arts and social impact to a much more inviting relationship between art and social value, and I think a really, really rigorous exploration of what that actually looks like in practice. Thank you, panelists, so much for enriching this conversation. Thank you, Professor Crossick.